So, welcome to tonight's Career Conversations Books Clubs. I am Gina Alexandris. I am really thrilled to be here with Mahwash Khan, who is my co-facilitator for tonight's wonderful book, Brene Brown's Atlas of the Heart: Mapping Meaningful Connection in the Language of Human Experience. Mahwash, welcome. We're going to come back to you in a few seconds, but I'm so thrilled that you are joining us this evening. As I said, today's conversation is going to be a little bit different. Usually we have the author, and Dr. Brown couldn't be with us to discuss this wonderful book, but I've got a great surrogate in Mahwash because she is absolutely wonderful in terms of understanding and learning and wanting to learn more about Dr. Brown's work. And so I'm really glad that we're going to have this conversation this evening. Just a little bit to open before we get started, and I will stop sharing this now just so that we could move forward. Um, the conversation started a couple of years ago because of my love of three things, and I wanted to marry three things: books and reading, which I just adore, powerful career conversations, and bringing people together in community. And it was really important to be able to do that. And I've had the good fortune of being able to have some really powerful conversations over these past 2 years. If you feel like you want to post about it, please feel free to with hashtag GA Career Conversations. We're going to soon hear from Mahwash, who is the co-facilitator, and a little bit about how we're operating tonight, which is a little bit different than other evenings when we've had the author with us. We are going to be talking with Mahwash about the book, but first we're going to start, just as we do with the authors, about her career journey, because we do get people interested in other people's career journey and what has happened to them, how they've navigated the successes, the challenges. So we're going to invite Mahwash to talk to us about her career journey. And then she and I will talk about the book in particular with some questions that come from Brene Brown's discussion guide that I had sent around and posted, but others that we had thought about from the context of those who are in the legal profession. And as she reminded me several times during past conversations, all of these emotions and experiences can relate to lawyers and those in the legal profession, but we're going to try and zero in on a few of them. And if we have people joining us and they want to ask questions, by all means, feel free to do so. I'd ask you to keep muted for a bit, and then you can join afterwards. And as we're looking at this, just to reinforce again, as I mentioned, we are recording. And if you wanted to join in the conversation after our introduction, please, you can either just unmute or put your hand up, and then we'll have you join. This is eligible for 1.5 hours professionalism credit for the Law Society for any Ontario lawyers. And before we move forward, I wanted to just include one thing that I do in all of my career conversations book clubs. The goal for these conversations is to inform, to learn, and to have open, brave, and powerful conversations. I used to always say that I want to have brave conversations. And I came across the work of Elisa Hankora, whose article, and I'm so very grateful to her work, reminded me that brave spaces for many individuals can be absolutely exhausting. And so instead, I suggest, as she suggests in her article, that this be an accountable space in which we are each responsible for ourselves, our intentions, our words, and our actions. And it means entering a space with good intentions, but understanding that aligning your intent with action is a true test of commitment. So to that end, I will be aiming to adhere to the accountable space guidelines that I've sent around to people previously. So as we get started, I want to invite Mahwash, first of all, to share with us. You've got an incredible, I've heard it before, some of it. I'm sure you're going to surprise me with a few things, but you've got an incredible career story, much of it with a focus on diversity and equity. Can you share with us briefly your personal highlights of your career journey? How and why and when did you start each of the roles you had? And when did you decide to move on and why? So I'm going to turn it over to you, Mahwash, with great thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Gina. I'm super excited to be here today. Obviously, to be in your company is always wonderful, but to then talk about this incredible book, which I love so much, is really exciting. So, and hello to everybody who's joining us, who are watching the or who'll be watching the recording later. So, my name is Mahwash Khan, and my pronouns are she, her. Um, And, it's interesting. You know, I think of my career sort of a bit of a experimentation and a lot of perseverance. So that's kind of how I'm going to set the tone. But just by way of background, as a diplomat's daughter, I've lived in 9 different countries, 5 different continents. And really, moving around, I was exposed to so many cultures, traditions, and people. And I think that helped me build not only my cultural humility skills, which I think was always kind of percolating in there, but also my sort of resiliency muscles, right, and adaptability skills, things that I think we need as lawyers, things that we need as human beings. But I've always been drawn to helping people. And that's really what led me to law. I think as a kid, I was always a problem solver. People came to me with their problems and often come to me for advice. So and I think I don't think I've mentioned this before, but my dad was a strong influence, sort of
Mm.
encouraging me to pursue a career in law, maybe based on some of the things he saw in me. But there was also some healthy competition with my brother, who was also on the path to becoming a doctor. So he's older. So I think for me, it was like, oh, I better do something just as good, right? So I completed my law degree in England. I had started to working in England as a solicitor, but then I had to move to Canada and I went through the NCA process, which is right, like for internationally trained lawyers. Um, and because I was off the mainstream, I had a lot of difficulty finding an articling position actually. And I just wasn't sure, which area interested me the most at that point. I had thought about criminal law, but again, my dad being a big influence in my life kind of persuaded me not to go in that direction. But I was always interested in working with marginalized people, marginalized women in particular. And so um, I guess I sort of fell into family law, if you will, just based on the type of articling position that I was able to get as well, in a full service firm. And yeah, so fell into family law, and by the way, at that time, I didn't even realize all the other avenues that could be available to a lawyer, like there's so much you can do with a legal background. But at that time, it was just like, oh, I knew about private practice. And so the law firm I joined specialized in domestic abuse cases. Needless to say, I burnt out really quickly.
That's a
Um,
heavy area.
it's a really tough area, and I'm an empath, and so
Mm.
in trying to build relationships with my clients, I actually became too attached. And in the book, we talk a little bit about empathy, and we'll talk about that later, but I was feeling the feelings for the people, as an empath. And I think that was for family law. I think that was a tough match.
Mhm.
Um, Also, at that time, I hadn't really developed the necessary coping skills, right? Nobody teaches you about those types of things. I hadn't developed the coping skills. I didn't have a good self-care practice like I
Mhm.
do now. I was newly married, about to become a new mom. So it was just too much for me. So I did change direction. So I changed my practice into real estate, and primarily because the firm wanted to do more real estate. Um,
Same firm.
the
So same firm. You stayed at the same firm. Yep.
I was in
Yep.
the same firm.
Yep.
Yeah, I stayed in the
Mhm.
same firm, but I switched my practice to sort of wills and estates, but
Mhm.
mostly real estate. And I enjoyed it well enough, but I also knew that it was a high practice. It was a high risk area, right? And real estate is high risk. And also, I didn't have any proper mentorship. So not only was I new to the country, trying to practice, I didn't know where or how to really find mentors who would help me with my big real estate questions, if you will. Um, so that kind of started, weighing heavily on me. I wanted a more steady pay because I was, basically I was you earn what you do. And there was a lot of overhead. I wanted more life balance, more work-life balance, or work-life integration, whatever you want to call it, paid vacation, et cetera, et cetera. So I left private practice and joined Law Pro, and actually I used a recruiter for that, or a headhunter. So I was headhunted into Law Pro, um, and again, it was a little bit by design, I guess. But I held various positions at Law Pro, and I was there for 18 years. Um, and I do want to say that I stayed much longer than I probably should have.
Mhm.
And I did try and make a few moves while I was at Law Pro, and I failed over and over again. I applied for a number of positions internally, and I didn't get them. I applied to two other organizations, and I was shortlisted for one, came really close to getting that one. Didn't go through, didn't happen. I applied to another organization. I actually got a pretty cool job offer for a manager of EDI. So towards the end of the 18 years of Law Pro, I kind of started figuring out where I wanted to go. So I did get a job offer for a manager of EDI at a charity.
Mhm.
However, the day that I was supposed to sign the contract, they rescinded the contract
Oh.
um, because of some reorg that was happening, right? And it's really interesting because it was so devastating at the time, and there were so many sort of like attempts at trying and failing,
Mhm.
um, that it's interesting because sometimes, that saying that things happen for a reason, sometimes it feels like there is something behind that, right?
Yeah.
And in fact, reflecting back, if I had been successful in any of those other candidacies, I probably wouldn't have taken the time to do some deep reflecting
Mhm.
on what is it that I actually want to do with my life, right? And I got some career coaching many years ago. And I even joined, a women's empowerment networking group for 6 months, which is, a
Mhm.
lot of changing mindsets, talking about limiting beliefs and how that plays into actioning our goals and things like that. So it was really, really interesting. But just back to Law Pro a little bit.
Mhm.
Before I left, I was counsel Law Pro Communications. So I did a lot of internal and external corporate communications. And I'm a bit of a grammar nerd, self-proclaimed grammar nerd. So I really loved that stuff. And it was really interesting to me. And I did a lot of risk management type of stuff. So, basically, and that was something that I enjoyed the most is like helping lawyers practice
Mhm.
smarter and do more risk management.
Mhm.
Um, in a general sense, but also because of my real estate background, I would focus a little bit on the real estate practice piece,
Mhm.
and also, the cultural competency piece and how, there can be malpractice claims because of lack of cultural intelligence. And however, towards the end, I think what I'm most proud of is the learning and experience around, EDI or IDEA, as we call it in my current law firm, Siskins, which is inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. So why the switch from Law Pro? So as many of us do, I eventually felt this need for sort of a deeper purpose, if you will.
Mhm.
I wanted to work directly, somewhere that was aligned with my core values. So I did a lot of exercises sort of to find what are my key core values. So I decided to, figure out how to do idea work full time. And so I started with the education piece. Sometimes they say when you want to do something, you have to start building the tools now to
Indeed.
do what you want to do in the future. So I took a 1-year certificate course at Centennial College called Certificate in Inclusion. It was fantastic. I loved it so much. I also did a 2-year course at U of T for adult learning and development because I somehow wanted to combine those two things. Um, and then I started reaching out to others in the space. who did this work. And I just started networking. And, you know, networking doesn't come to me easily. It's not my favorite thing to do. Many people say that, right? But I knew that I had to do something and I had to talk to other people. So this led me to sort of focus my career in DEI. And I have to say that I guess I was always kind of doing something,
I was going to say, yeah, there's a theme, right?
right? But yeah, so that was kind of, and just along the way, some of the key lessons,
Mhm.
the importance of building strong relationships,
Yeah.
the importance of taking the time to reach out and just find those mentors. I think that's something I learned much later on in my career life. The themes of perseverance, and resilience in the face of challenges, continuous learning. That's definitely been a theme throughout my life. Just staying super curious, and then developing, empathy as an inclusive leader. And as you know very well, Gina, my learning around self-compassion, which I absolutely love you know,
Mhm.
yeah.
You have so many. One of the things that struck me is that you started off by speaking to us about appreciating now that you hadn't yet developed your self-care habits or your self-care opportunities or options. There's a lot of development that happens, and I think that that understanding, that reflection that comes with time and with experience is really, really important. That we don't know what we don't know sometimes at either the beginning of our career or when we make a change, for that matter. And the vulnerability that you expressed in terms of I applied and I failed. We've all been there and we don't talk about that. We never apply. We just get the jobs that we get the jobs for. No, but how many applications have gone behind that? And I think I'm grateful to you for sharing that and for reminding us that for each position that you've had, there are a number of positions. I don't know what the numbers are for me or for you, but oodles of applications that have been rejected. And the accompanying emotions that come with that and the accompanying lessons that come from that. And as I mentioned earlier, I keep seeing some themes along the way, some connectors to the work that you have always done. There's sort of been pathways. You might not see them clearly at that moment, but boy, are there ever pathways that connect to among the different things that you've had. And I know you've sort of mentioned some of it was planned out, but one of my favorite words is serendipity, and I've asked all my authors, so I'm going to ask you as well as co-facilitator. Um, as a career coach, I help people strategize and plan their elements of their career. But I also recognize the very strong importance that serendipity plays. So I'm wondering what part of your career has been, or how much of your career has been serendipity, sort of those chance encounters that we actually make happen, although they are chance, and how much has been more strategic and focused and planned.
That is a really fascinating question. And it's interesting because I have never reflected on that, right? It's just like just going with it feels like it was experimental, as I said.
Hmm.
But I think it was part necessity, sort
Hmm.
of a blend of necessity, um, some planning, although I don't know how strategic it was, but there was definitely planning, and happenstance. So I like the word happenstance too, right?
Hmm.
Serendipity. So like fortunate happenstance,
Yeah.
um, and perhaps a touch of manifestation. And I was always curious about the concept of manifestation. And I've even experimented with it a little bit. Visualizing the
Mhm.
ideal career or whatever, and the kind of impact I wanted to make in the world. And while I had a general sort of goal of using my skills to sort of make make an impact, um, I think the focus on the EDI, or DEI idea, whatever we want to call it, kind of emerged organically.
Yeah.
But again, I do believe in the importance of goal setting, and I certainly, I'm a list person. I love lists.
Mhm.
I do a list every morning. And I don't even want to know at the end of the day how many I'm able to cross off, but so organizing that way, charting a course. But I also acknowledge the power of serendipity. And also the intriguing possibility that our thoughts and intentions can shape our reality, right? So doing those reflection exercises,
Mhm.
setting those goals, but then doing that really uncomfortable stuff of actioning
Mhm.
them is important too, right? So again, we talked about the failed attempts, and I also reflect a lot of the mindset type of stuff that happens after each failed attempt.
Mhm.
Um, and at this stage of my life, though I didn't know it back then,
Right.
and I think, with life experience comes that wisdom, is that seeing seeing those challenges as opportunities, right?
Mhm.
And as what Eckhart Tolle says, see every difficult person as a spiritual teacher.
Mhm.
So just similar for life's experiences, I think, similar kind of mindset.
So very true. And you've already sort of highlighted without necessarily us getting into there some of the emotions and experiences that we'll talk about. So let's get into the book. And I'm so grateful to you in terms of sharing the career trajectory, because I think that's really, really helpful for people to hear and to connect with at various points. But this book, and yes, right now it's tabbed and whatnot, but you gave me this beautiful book about a year ago. And you said I had, because I was, we had met not met, but we had met up at one of my emotional intelligence classes, and you gifted me this beautiful book about emotions. And I thought back then, oh, I want to get into it, right away. And it's not a book that I got into right away. And I'm so glad that I actually waited for a while. What I enjoy doing, I know you've talked about liking to hear the book, but I actually enjoyed the pages that had all the quotes, for example,
Mhm.
and some of the beautiful photos or paintings that she's copied or that she's been using in here, and those evoked so much as well as the words within this book. So let me just ask you. I ask our authors, what was their why, the why of writing this book or researching the book or and getting it out into the world. So I'm turning to you and I'm asking, what was the reason why you chose to gift this book to me? What was important about it for you to share with me, and then to so graciously and so enthusiastically to say, I want to talk about it. I want to join you in sharing it with others as well. What was your why for this book?
Um, so for starters, I love talking about emotions, right? I
Yes.
absolutely love talking about emotions. And I share the quote, and I believe it's in this book, but I use it in my presentations. We are not necessarily thinking machines, we are feeling machines that
Mhm.
think, right? And that's the quote by Anthony Damasio that Brene Brown talks about. And so I guess because for me, her work has been so incredibly impactful in terms of understanding emotions. Um, I know you already deeply value emotional intelligence, right? And you're a
Mhm.
champion of teaching those concepts to others. And I felt that this book really beautifully complements the work that you already do, the teaching that you already do. So so that was basically for me, it was like, of course, emotional intelligence, all
Mhm.
these different kinds of emotions, how to manage our own emotions, how to read other people's emotions. So Atlas of the Heart provides this rich tapestry vocabulary framework, if you will, right? You use the word like a map, as she does, for understanding the emotional landscape is very sort of nuanced.
Mhm.
It's not simple at all. And so by sharing the book, basically, I hoped to offer you a valuable resource, if you will, that could further your own understanding, enrich your own understanding, and then provide you with even more tools to equip your students
Mhm.
with the emotional intelligence, self-awareness that they need to thrive in the legal profession, but also at the same time make a impact in the world.
Yeah.
Because I think managing our emotions, it has this ripple effect um,
Yeah. No,
around people around us, right?
I think you're so true about that. And I love even your use of language of tapestry, and not an atlas, not a guide, and not a map, but a tapestry. And I think it's so really incredible. One of the things that struck me when I started reading the book was that she referenced a uh, survey that she had done where she was asking people to name emotions. And I was shocked, and I had to go back and reread it, that she said people could name three emotions:
Yeah.
happy, sad, and angry. And when you think about how are you feeling? I'm okay. How are you feeling? I'm fine. I'm happy. I'm good today. I'm sad. Those three were sort of the language that people would come up with. And as she writes language, and I love her, I'm going to quote her directly. It's our
Hmm.
portal to meaning making, connection, healing, learning, and self-awareness. And so her book, Atlas of the Heart, offers us that guide, that tapestry, an atlas to our emotions vocabulary, because part of building emotional intelligence is expanding our emotions vocabulary. So she helps us to better understand and connect not just with others, but also to connect with ourselves, which can be as scary as anything, as we all know, right?
Hmm.
And she's done 87, she's used 87 emotions and experiences. And I don't remember if there was a magic to the 87, Mahwash, or not, but 87 is certainly more than three. So she takes us through the history and the meaning and her definition and explanation of 87 different experiences and emotions, and she's labeled both of them. So we're going to turn to, so thank you for gifting it to me. Thank you for bringing it forward, because I've already tabbed places where I'm going to be introducing elements into the course, and it also is a chance to have this conversation today. So Tiffany, if you are interested, please feel free to join at any time. But we're going to get into some of the discussion questions. What we're going to look at right now, there's three discussion guide questions that Mahwash and I want to explore that Brene Brown has posted. We're going to do the first three in particular, and we're just going to have a conversation about those. And then what we thought, given that Career Conversations is really mostly focused on the legal profession, even though all of these are relevant to members of the legal profession, we're going to come back to a few of them in particular and just explore how they impact lawyers going about their day-to-day activity in particular. But from the discussion guide, the first question that Brene asks us is, did any of the explanations of specific emotions or experiences surprise you? If yes, what was surprising? Mahwash, let me start with you first of all. What surprised you within this book?
So many things.
Right.
It's really, this book is, and we talked about this briefly, hours. You could talk about it for hours, right?
Hmm.
Because obviously there are so many different emotions. But again, for me, I think one of the things wasn't, you know, the meaning that I thought certain words had, I had them wrong.
Hmm.
So there were some words like even envy and jealousy, right? The difference between, like, we use jealousy quite a bit. Like, she used the example of when somebody is on vacation and we say, "Oh, I'm so jelly, hashtag jelly, I'm so jealous," but really it's envy. And so just sort of like wrapping my head around the fact that I had so many definitions wrong. Um, Things that I weren't familiar with. So, for
Hmm.
example, I'll give you one example: foreboding joy.
Hmm.
Right? I had never really turned my mind to what that meant in terms of this bittersweet anticipation that accompanies joy.
Yeah.
Right? So you're having joy, but you're also feeling this dread at the same
Hmm.
time. And so that is one thing that, and because when I was reading it, I'm like, I recognize that feeling so well. So for example, right, joy that my daughter is driving home from university, but this sort of like deep sort of like anxiety that the weather is bad and she's
Right.
driving, and so joy with, foreboding joy. It's
Mhm.
like it really makes a lot of sense to me now. So that was sort of one of the things. Also, along the same vein, this experience is associated with grief. First of all, that the way she describes grief, and
Mhm.
that was really resonated with me. And I think that we've all, grief has touched almost everybody's life in
Yeah.
some way or another. And while I understood grief to be sort of this response to loss, I didn't fully consider how many forms it could take, right?
Right.
So grief over missed opportunities and that we don't actually grieve them.
Mhm.
And then I was thinking about I was reflecting when I was doing, reflecting on that, on your first question, about you don't really process that, right? It's like dust yourself up,
Yeah.
get up and move on. And grief over, the passage of time. You kind of reflect on that a little bit. And I don't know if you've seen the new Tom Hanks movie here.
I haven't yet, but I
It's
want to. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really, it ties into that about, the whole passage of time and how quickly it goes by in this movie. You see it go by so quickly, but also, you know, now that, I'm an empty nester, sort
Mhm.
of grieving that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what about you, Gina? What did
There's
you?
so much. And to your point, there's so many things that, in terms of the word surprise, and I wanted to, just to focus on that. There's so many different places where I thought, aha, oh yes, oh wow, that was a surprise. And I kept hearing that in my head. And I've got to say, going through this once is not enough. Like I know
Mhm.
that there's so many things that I sort of um bypass, not bypass, but just ran over too quickly, either because they were hard for me to actually delve into, and that caught me by surprise. There's some parts where I actually wasn't prepared to read them at this point in time, just because there was too much work that I think was going to be needed, that I had to sort of go, okay, just skim and come back to it. But it's a resource. It really is a resource. The part that really hit me, that really resonated, and I was surprised at it, was nostalgia. And I think it's in chapter
Mhm.
5, 4 or 5. I can't remember. Chapter 5, I think it is. But in nostalgia, the again, the historical reference, the historical information that she provides about words is really, really incredible. She talks about the dark past about nostalgia, that it was actually a medical disease and a psychiatric disorder. That shocked the heck out of me. For one,
Mhm.
from a person who tends to bathe in nostalgia, I kind of see it as this whimsical, beautiful thing. Thinking about that other side of nostalgia and the challenge of nostalgia was really surprising for me. I had never thought about it in that way. And as a child of immigrants, and as one who works with a lot of immigrant professionals, a lot of immigrants, this one really, really hit home because I'm often hearing people um, really be nostalgic about home, wherever home or their
Right.
original home may be, or about my history, or, I was once a XYZ and now I'm just starting over again, or it's really a difficult situation here. Many of us get nostalgic about, past elections or past circumstances or past lives or past careers or past jobs, for example. And it was interesting, her definition. And it just, again, I had to sort of pause and really, really allow myself to let it sink in. She defines it as a yearning for the way things used to be in our often idealized and self-protected version of the past. And it just reminded me, apart from so many things that I have sort of waxed nostalgic about, how many conversations I've had with internationally trained lawyers, for example, who
Mm.
idealize the past. And when we start digging in and having conversations, okay, yeah, it wasn't, the greatest, or it wasn't this, or it wasn't that. And her two questions, Mavash, that she asks in that area really were good reminders to us of that dual side, if you will, of nostalgia. She says, when we feel nostalgia, ask yourself two things. Were the comfort and safety of that past existence real? And that was the aha moment. That was the surprising part. Um, and and the second one, if so, were they at someone else's expense? And I just think that I don't know
Right.
why her whole discussion about nostalgia threw me for a loop. Like it wasn't what I was, to me, nostalgia has always been this lovely, beautiful, positive energy. But boy, there can be some challenges and some dark sides definitely to this experience, to this emotion.
That's yeah, that's really fascinating.
Hmm.
It really was eye-opening to me too. It's actually you reminded me of that one because like you said, I'm an immigrant, and
Hmm.
so for me, it's interesting that when I'm here, I miss home,
Hmm.
but when I go visit there, I realize why I left,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
It's like, yeah, it's great to be here for a vacation, but I don't want to live here. But again, you're here and a couple of years go by and it's like, oh, things, back home and stuff.
Hmm.
So it's, yeah, that was really, really interesting.
And thinking
Yeah.
about, if it was a safety and comfort, did it come at somebody's expense, for example?
Mhm.
And whether it's family or friends or other members of society or other members of the community that you may not have
Right.
thought about at that point. So it was a fascinating, a lot of what she writes seeps through so many parts of our lives, right? Not just careers, but so many parts of our lives. Tiffany, if you feel like sharing any of your comments, please let me know. Feel free to do so. But we're going to move to the second question. So they're kind of similar. I found them kind of similar, but apart from surprise, she asked, did you come across any emotion or experience and think, that's what that feeling is called, or I know that experience. And I gotta say, yeah, I did a few times over. But Mamas, let's start with you. Which ones made you think that's what it's called? Aha. Or yep, I've had that experience.
Um, I think for me, the way she describes, and I can't remember the chapter actually, but let me have a quick look. It was around numbness.
Oh, I don't remember that one. Uh-oh. I
And
wonder
it
if
was
that's one that I avoided.
and it was really interesting because for me, it's almost like um, the way she describes it, the way it manifests is as a coping mechanism in the face of overwhelming emotions. And so it seems like such a simple term, right? But it has such a complex, it's actually a very complex thing. But for me, it was like, oh, okay, so I go numb. So that's what happens. But it's really explored in a very, very thoughtful way. And I thought that was really, really interesting. Um, I mean, I don't know, there's just so many. And I know that I want to jump into it a little bit, but this thing that around empathy and sympathy, and I don't know if you want to say that for later, so we
Let's come
can
back to that. Yeah, let's
we
come
can
back to
come
that.
back to that. Okay.
Let's come back
Okay.
to that one. It's interesting. There were two that there were a number of them. Oh, I know that experience, but the two in particular, one was a pair, the awe and wonder, and the difference between awe and wonder.
Mm,
She describes it, and I loved her diagrams that she has. I think it's at page. I wrote a note down, 60 and 61.
right.
Awe, how it looks, how it feels, and what it does to us, and
Right.
wonder makes us go deeper into something with curiosity, which I loved, and awe, we just are a part of it. And there's so many times where I love the word awe, and when I've experienced
Mm,
it, it's something that we all need every so often to allow ourselves just to fall in awe and just to be able to explore that and being able to think about, moments when I've been in, wonder is when I got curious, but awe, every sunset, for example,
yes. Yes.
is always I guess if you're an early morning person, sunrises might do it for you as well. But even just seeing children play, or those things just fill me in awe. And very similarly, but she has it in a different chapter. In a similar way, um, the word that I would never have thought about using, I don't know if I've ever used it necessarily, bittersweet. And the two
Mm,
elements of happiness and sadness. And I'll read out her definition on page 74 is the bittersweet side of appreciating life's precious moments is the unbearable awareness that hit me, the unbearable awareness that those moments are passing. And again, that duality, right? The bitter plus the sweet at the same time. And I never really think about experiences in that way until I read it. And then I thought, yeah, there are very many times when I've experienced, that bittersweet feeling. Graduations, and I used to love graduations when I worked at universities and law schools. But there was this, yay, you've done it, completed, and then, oh, you're gone from us now. I'm not going to see you on a regular basis. I've seen you for 3 years in this school, and now you're moving on as you should. But there was that sort of both the happiness and the sadness, the time with my parents where I would love spending time with them, but I knew that, at some point I wouldn't have that anymore. Walks with my son, as simple as that. And here's where
Yeah.
sunsets come up as well. It's that, oh, how beautiful. And it's the end of the day. The day is now.
Yes.
The day is
Yes.
now gone. So that, again, those two, for me, that awe and wonder, and I group those two separate ones together, and bittersweet. Being able to have those labels and really reflect on awe. And I know that there have been a number of LinkedIn posts on awe, for example, really comes up. So to your point, there are so many opportunities for us to just sit down and explore the emotions that we think about. And we're going to come to sympathy and empathy in a little bit, but um, it, I'm filled with gratitude for having the ability to think about 87 different possible emotions. But though
Yeah.
that one in particular really, really came close to me. Um, her,
I had one more. Oh,
yeah, no, no, go ahead, go ahead.
I didn't know if you were moving on to the next question.
I was going to, but go ahead. Let's stay on this one.
Yeah, so another one that actually, so it's interesting. It came up, the word resentment.
Mm,
I found that was really, really interesting. And her example, so this is page 2930. And so her example was really interesting, but I'm gonna sort of like read what her definition of resentment is. Resentment is the feeling of frustration, judgment, anger, better than, and or hidden envy
mhm,
related to perceived unfairness or injustice. It's an emotion that we often experience when we fail to set boundaries
mm,
or ask for what we need, or when expectations let us down because they were based on things we can't control, like what other people think, what they feel, or how they're going to react. So, this is one of those ones where I don't think I quite understood resentment, and I understand it much better now. And her example that, she gives is that, you know, um, there was somebody, and again, it's on page 30, so I'm just going to,
mhm.
paraphrase and just do a quick summary. So it's like when somebody was saying to her, something was due the next day, and this person was like, "Oh, you know what? I'm just gonna call it a night now and come back to it
I
tomorrow."
remember that.
So she said that she had this feeling that she thought was resentment against that person not working hard enough.
Mhm,
However, she later, after doing the research around this emotion, came to realize that it wasn't that person's lack of work making her resentful. It was her lack of rest herself that was
yeah,
making her resentful. So it's sort of like, I'm not furious that you're okay with something that's just good enough and you're going to come back to it tomorrow. I'm furious because I want to be okay with something that's really good and imperfect, and I don't give myself permission for that.
yeah,
So I thought that
yeah.
was really, really interesting.
Yeah, that was powerful. I remember as you're saying that, I remember reading that and thinking, oh, I've been in that kind of situation where I'm thinking it's about the other, and actually it's about me. And
Yeah.
being able to appreciate and understand that is really a meaningful lesson, and one that we don't allow ourselves sometimes to have, right? So yeah, no, that there again, there's so many different possibilities here. Um, but that's a strong one as well. Let let's think about her next question. I know that when you and I were prepping and we were talking about this, um, it was an interesting question to us, but are there any behaviors you might work toward changing because of something you learned from Atlas? And part of my thinking when we first had this question was everything. No, okay, hang on. We can't change everything. Let's
Right.
not get overboard here. What came up for you in terms of behavior you might change because of something that you learned here?
Again, there's so much. There's so much
Hmm.
here. I want to say that one of the things that kept coming up for me is when I was reading it, I was like, oh, I got this wrong. Oh, I got this wrong.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it was actually giving myself grace for getting it wrong. And again, that self-compassion piece that I keep talking about, right? Because there were some things in here where I was like, how could I get it wrong? So giving myself sort of like the self-compassion, but also being more mindful. Again, when I dug into the resentment, and I actually went further and I looked up the research a little bit. Um, Being more mindful of my own emotional responses, and being more intentional in how I express them now. But one of the things that, and I'm going to come back to the communication piece, but one of the things that resonated with me was how she says that, you know, we think that, that we feel the feeling first and then we sort of action it. But the way that she described it was that, and she used the example of stress and overwhelm, right?
Mm-hmm.
The difference between stress and overwhelm. And the way she described it was that, if we are having a stressful day, but we are saying, oh, and we do that all the time, I'm so overwhelmed. I'm so overwhelmed, right? The body follows what the brain is telling our body the emotion we're feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And so that for me was, I think it's quite life changing for me. So I'm very mindful now of the terminology I use for the emotion that I'm feeling. And I don't go as far as like, okay, pause on that emotion, go check it in the book.
Almost, no.
Although,
Mhm.
I think I'll try that a little bit,
Mhm.
but especially around those two words, because we say them a lot at work, we say them a lot in our personal lives, that the body's response to the word overwhelm is a lot more serious than the body's response to the word I'm stressed, or I'm a little stressed, or I'm a lot stressed.
Mhm.
So I think that that's one of the things that I'm more mindful of. Taking a pause and really digging into what I'm about to label myself,
Mhm.
knowing that it actually will have a consequence in my body.
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the very beautiful benefits of this book and her work and our conversations about it is that expanding our emotional vocabulary really, really does have an impact, as you said, on how we think, feel, behave, and then also how we experience others as well. So if we experience, if we hear others saying, "I'm stressed," okay, that's nothing because you're not yet overwhelmed. Well, are they actually meaning overwhelmed? Or if they're saying they're overwhelmed, are they actually meaning stressed? And their responsiveness is showing up in different ways, as you said. And so being more mindful is really something that overall, and I think that's part of the learning from her materials and her research is being more mindful, being more attuned, thinking a little bit about the language that we use because it can have such a huge impact on us. For me, the word that she used that, and it seems so minimal, really, but it had a bit of a powerful impact, and that was the word boredom. When I first saw that, I thought, nah, because what I wrote down in preparation for us is, in terms of change, embracing it more in our profession, and I dare say in professional culture, there's this um, incentive, philosophy, belief that we've got to be on the go. keep going, just keep do, be, and to the point of overwhelm sometimes, or to the point of stress potentially. And it was beautiful how she, she defined it as the uncomfortable state of wanting to engage in satisfying activity, but being unable to do it. Like just sit and do something satisfying. Don't necessarily,
Right.
that frustration. And the reminder, one of the studies that she quoted, boredom is also your imagination calling to you. And if we can just be bored, it's that, as kids, sometimes kids just need to not, we can't structure their days. We can't let them do something, be
Right.
always doing something. Because when will that imagination fall into place? When they just experiment and try and practice and think and just have ideas come up? But it's not just children that need it. Adults, professionals, people in the legal profession need to be bored sometimes, need to actually just let their mind soar and just let their mind flow and just let their
Mhm.
mind imagine. And it was oh boy, yeah, especially in the craziness of the holiday season, right?
Yeah.
Where you got to
Right.
do, and I have no time for boredom. Hmm. Maybe it's what I
Mm.
really need to be able to just kind of think about and imagine next steps. It just, again, it's one of those, a lot of the things in her book just kind of hit you going, oh boy, that's a good reminder, a good, I don't want to say a warning sign, but it certainly is a good reminder, an eye opener.
Yeah, because I think that the do and be like it's heading sometimes it's heading to a place of overwhelm or
Mhm.
right? And you're absolutely right. Like we just don't like I don't remember the last time I was bored.
Right?
Right?
Yeah.
And one of the interesting things, because I think it kind of ties into what I was saying about overwhelm and I think she mentioned a quote by John Kabat-Zinn about overwhelm
Mhm.
is you know the world is unfolding faster than our psyche can keep up with.
Yeah.
And one of the antidotes to overwhelm is nothingness, right?
Yeah.
And this is sort of like scientifically researched that you actually do nothing for 10 minutes. So I think that there's so much more conversation, especially around mental health these days,
Mhm.
about the need to actually sometimes really do nothing and rest.
Give ourselves permission and give others, like if we're leaders, give others permission to do nothing and to rest, but also to give ourselves permission, especially those who are in leadership roles, um, that thinking that we we cannot possibly have downtime, we cannot possibly have, that's so false. And yeah, and I think, as you said it, the pace of change is so constant, so immersive, and so many things are happening around us. Sometimes doing nothing. I when we equate it to meditation, many people, and I'm one of those that says, I can't meditate. My brain can't slow down, but I can do nothing. There are times when I might not be meditating, and I don't like using that
Mm.
term, but I certainly can do nothing for 10 minutes and giving ourselves permission. I don't know if maybe I'm your thought on whether or not we need to give permission. I feel like in our professional culture, it actually is necessary to give permission and to let people know that there is a benefit in rest and in nothingness.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
And I think that more conversations are happening around that.
yeah.
And because the Sherbrooke University report around the mental health in the legal profession is at critical
Mhm.
sort of like a critical point right now where we need to start paying attention to these things for sure.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Tiffany, I'm going to just let you know that if you wanted to join, by all means, please do. Otherwise, we're going to go into a few areas or a few chapters that Mavish and I, as we were thinking about, we've already covered sort of the first chapter necessarily, right? Of places where, what's the correct line? When you go when things are uncertain or too much. So we've sort of already covered that. But let's look at, it was interesting, chapter 2, places we go when we compare, and she talked about comparison, admiration, reverence, You've already spoken about envy and jealousy, resentment, and I don't know how to pronounce the word, so maybe you do. Schadenfreude and
Schadenfreude, Freudenfreude.
Freudenfreude.
Yeah.
So as lawyers, it starts almost as law students, right?
Mm,
That whole comparison. And I love her phrase, the definition of comparison, be like everyone else, but better. The crush of conformity. And just
yeah.
even having that word crush. Any of these, we've already talked about some of these, resentment in particular, but anything else that you'd want to say about this in terms of the legal profession in particular, Mahwash?
Um, I think that, there is perhaps even envy, right? The emotion. I think that, resentment, again, I want to go back to the resentment, but because that can come up as feelings of, unfairness, being overworked or underappreciated,
Mhm,
which happens a lot because I think that um, people don't know how to express their appreciation, like really simple things.
mhm,
And I think that the resentment can fester from that. So that one, now Schadenfreude, I think that was one of those really, really interesting ones, right? Having pleasure in somebody else's kind of pain.
mhm,
So I think that, you know, I mean, law is necessarily an adversarial profession, but does it really have to be that way? Do we really, if co-counsel or opposing counsel is struggling, like, do we really need to sort of feel pleasure in their struggle?
yeah.
I think that it's really interesting to sort of read what these emotions actually can do um, for building relationships and camaraderie in the profession. So I mean, and you talked about comparison, which I think is super important. That's a really super important one for sure.
Alash, as you very well know from the course that I do on emotional intelligence, our profession is all about relationships. That's the language that I use, but connections, to use her language, whether it's with colleagues, whether it's with supervisors, whether it's with people that we supervise, whether it's with clients, whether it's with courts. There's so many people in our profession with whom we are building relationships and connections. And in this particular one, Schadenfreude, as she states, nothing that celebrates the humiliation or pain of another person builds lasting connection. So if our
Mhm.
goal is to build that lasting connection, let's not take joy and in somebody else's pain. Let's really appreciate and understand how to manage that. And to understand that, okay, if you're on that um, if you're on that path, if you will, what can you do to acknowledging it, understanding it, and then how do you come back from that path, right? So you're not experiencing that. But I think it's really important. The whole idea of connections in our profession is really relevant. There's so many different people with whom we're interacting with. And then of course I didn't mention our personal life, right? Our family, our
Yeah.
friends, apart from the people that we're connecting with in uh, our day-to-day world. And then let me hear you say, is it Freudenfreud? Is that how that is said? Freudenfreud?
Schadenfreude and Freudenfreude.
Freudenfreud. But then
Yeah.
to end on a positive note, she says, the opposite of it, it's the enjoyment of another's success. It's also a subset of empathy. But to enjoy somebody else's success, to be able to elevate, to be able
Mm.
to amplify others, mentors and champions who really, really, I was having a conversation today with a coaching client who said, she had one person who was not at the table for her that would have really amplified her voice and given her, being a champion for her. And the person who was at the table really wasn't that much of a champion, didn't really take enjoyment in the other person's success and sort of didn't really help her along. But it's so really critical in our profession just to be able to, hey, you're doing great work. It doesn't take away from my work or anything about me. Congratulations, it's wonderful. Let's showcase that. Let's highlight that for others. And one of our authors this year, Lisa Bragg, talked about not just bragging, and she helps take away the shame in bragging, but seeing it as a positive, about our own achievements and accomplishments, but even supporting and extolling the great successes that others have as well. I think it's we build people up rather than knock them down. I think there's some benefit to that, and as lawyers, we may want to be doing that more. Not just women lawyers. And I'm going to say that male and female lawyers alike will, I think, better the whole profession once we can celebrate each other's successes.
Yeah. Yeah, and again that's also like on as a side note, it's kindness, right?
Yeah.
Like and the scientific evidence, proven impact of kindness that it has on ourselves and other people. And for Freud and Freuda, like you mentioned, her example about the two-time Olympic gold medalist
Mm.
soccer player,
Yeah.
and she said that, she explains that every time she scored a goal, the first thing she would do is point to the person who made the assist,
I
right?
love that. Yeah.
The coach who called the play. Um, and it's just about celebrating another
Mhm.
person's victory. So I'm glad that you ended that one on a positive note,
No,
because
absolutely.
that's really
Absolutely.
important too.
No, absolutely. So let's go to chapter 7, and this is where I want you to sort of share a little bit more about empathy and sympathy in particular. But um, ta thank you very much, Tiffany. Chapter 7 is about places we go with others, and it includes compassion, pity, empathy, um, sympathy, boundaries, which lawyers are not necessarily great at doing at all, and comparative suffering. So empathy and sympathy in particular. Let's stick to that for the time being. Tell me your thoughts on that, especially within the legal profession.
So, that empathy is one of my favorite words. I
Hmm.
love talking about empathy, and I actually love sharing. Um, if you go on YouTube and you type in Brene Brown empathy versus sympathy,
Hmm.
that little video that comes up, and Gina, you've probably seen it 3 times now.
Yep.
But I think it's such an important, it's so important to understand that distinction between empathy and sympathy. And I always like to say, and we touched upon it briefly, um, my understanding of empathy, and most people say, oh, empathy is putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, right? So I always take from Brene Brown's teaching about how she understands empathy. And so this has also shifted my thought, where empathy is not putting yourself in somebody else's shoes because you don't have that lived experience,
Yeah.
right? I can't possibly put myself in somebody else's shoes because I don't have that lived experience. It's it's listening, actively listening to somebody when they tell you what it's like in their shoes, and believe them,
Hmm.
right? So judgment is an empathy killer, as she says. Judgment has to stay out of it. If somebody is telling you their story, then you have to believe them without judgment. And sympathy is like feeling sorry for somebody, and that is not a connector, and that is not a relationship builder. So for me, I think that empathy is such an important skill, um, for in our personal lives as well, but even as lawyers, is because, you know, listening to somebody else's story and then sort of, advocating for them from their perspective, um, is really, really important. And then you kind of like stay out of judgment yourself.
As you're saying this, it took me back to one of the earlier questions in terms of behaviors that you might work toward changing because of something you learned. And I realized that this is an ongoing lesson. Each time I hear you speak, each time I hear we have a conversation about empathy, it reminds me, and you just said judgment is an empathy killer, and that I can, whether it's my training, my personality, I can get judgy at times. There's definitely that element there. And that reminder to myself, hang on, just because it doesn't match my experience, does not mean it cannot match the other person's experience, whether it's another, a colleague, a friend, a student, a
Mhm.
supervisor for that matter. And so that reminder is really useful. So thank you for again reminding us of that, because many of us who start law school, and maybe the training in law school is that judgment is there. We are expected to have critical thinking and judgment, and we mix critical thinking with judgment. And that idea that to be empathetic, you really need to leave judgment behind and just be actively listening, as you said, with a whole heart and without trying to think about yourself in that person's shoes. And I think what I'm going to do is post that little video that you mentioned, because I always love seeing it when
Mm.
together with these as a resource. But the difference between sympathy and empathy is really important in this. Anything else on that? Does boundaries come up for you on that, or should we just go on to the next chapter?
Yeah, I mean, this, I do want a couple more comments on the empathy,
Yeah.
because it is, so as you know, as she mentions, it's a tool of compassion, right? And one of the things I touched on earlier is because I'm an empath, when I was doing family law,
Mhm.
I was feeling the feelings for the person, right? And what happens then is sometimes is then you are then taking the spotlight away from the person, because all of us, so I mean, example, this scenario where it's like, your friend comes to you and they're something horrible happened and they're crying and you're like, oh my God, that's awful, and you start crying and you're like, yeah, something like that happened to me too. And all of a sudden it's now become about you. So
Right.
that is actually not empathy. And so I think, one of the learnings for me has been to really remember that when somebody is talking to you and sharing this experience, resist the temptation to jump in and either save them
Yeah.
or go straight to problem solving, which is what lawyers love to do,
Hmm.
right? Or do a comparison. And now it's a comparative suffering, right? Now you're comparing your suffering to their suffering, or whatever it is. And when Brene talks about comparison in that same chapter, she talks about the comparison suffering that happened during COVID, right? It's like, oh, um, my wedding got canceled because I can't have, people at my wedding, but I can't say anything about that because this person's parent died. So I think that those concepts, are really important, um, sort of to keep in mind when talking about, these concepts, like, um, in the legal profession.
Your comment, and it's just stuck with me. Resist the temptation to save, to problem solve, and to compare. And it's sort of well,
Mm.
I don't know if I want to say for all of us, but for me at least, I'll speak for myself personally. Those are the three early temptations, right? When you hear somebody's story, okay, let's get an answer to it, or oh, let me help you out, or oh yes, and I've had this, and so let me. Whoa, that was a good reminder that you offered, that we step back and just let the person tell their story, let the person experience what they have to, and ask, what can I do? What do you need? Right? That is something that we don't do enough of sometimes. And as lawyers, especially with our clients, we forget that the client might know what they need. They might not know the legal requirements or the legal
Right.
expectation, but they know what they want and what they need. And so let's not jump to advising straight ahead. And a little bit of empathy can go, and that sounds so trite, but it can go a long way for sure. That reminder,
Yeah.
the resisting the temptation, I think is really important.
And that's probably, you probably have cultivated those skills from your coaching background,
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
right?
one of the challenges, it's funny because anybody who was a lawyer or in an advising position really had to have that broken down for them in coaching, because we're not supposed to advise in coaching. And you're absolutely right that the intent to, or the desire to problem solve, or the skill of problem solving that comes up in one set of training really had to be put by the side in coaching. It's a whole different skill set. And it was hard. We found a lot of we were challenged. A lot of us who were doing coaching at that time, coach training, were challenged not to jump into the problem solving and the advising. A whole different ball game when you let other people experience what they need to experience on their own. So you're absolutely right. That's a tough one, but one for lawyers to remember for sure. Um, falling short. And I love that she labeled that as her eighth chapter. Places we go when we fall short. She said shame, self-compassion, which I know you absolutely love thinking about and reflecting on, perfectionism, which to me is a very important emotion and experience not to have within the legal profession. Um, I think those are really incredible. And I'll just start off by saying one of the things that I liked about uh, her definition of perfectionism, not striving to our best or excellence, but externally driven by what will people think. And boy, did that ever hit a chord. Growing
Mm.
up, we used to say our parents used to worry very much about what will people think. And that was, growing up, that was something that we'd hear all the time. In Greek, "Tithapio kosmos," what will people think? It was part of the standard daily
Yep. Yep. Same
conversation
in the
in our
South Asian
house,
culture.
right? And it took me a long time and I can't say that I'm 100% there, but it's at least an awareness now. Um, what will people think is there's an importance to it, an element of importance, but it shouldn't be driving our behavior all the time necessarily. And I think it can
Mhm.
be so difficult and so devastating for some people to deal with that. The other elements here in terms of falling short, she talks about is guilt, humiliation, and embarrassment. But of these, perfectionism or shame or
Shame.
self-compassion, talk to me about what resonates for you here in the legal profession.
Okay, so all of those, but shame, I think for shame, lawyers often face intense pressure and scrutiny,
Mhm.
perhaps, which can lead to feelings of shame around mistakes,
Yeah.
um, failures, or perceived inadequacies, if
Mhm.
you will. So I think that, and and by the way, the way I discovered Brene is by her first TED Talk on shame,
Mm.
right? I don't know, 14 million views by now, but it was so fascinating to me. Like, because she says that it's touches everything,
Yeah.
and it touches all of us, and it affects everything, right? And not only do we shame ourselves, but we shame others.
Mhm.
And interestingly enough, the work that I do, the idea work that I do, any kind of social justice work, cannot come from a place of shame and blame or judgment, because you cannot shame people into becoming inclusive people. It just doesn't work, right? And so for me, that concept is really, really important. I think people really need to understand what shame is, how it manifests in the workplace. So, for example, you know, um, it's EDI work, and I'm trying to do this work, and there's, a lawyer doesn't understand it, right? And so because lawyers are made to feel that they are supposed to have all the answers and they're supposed to know everything. And if they don't know something and
Mm.
they feel ashamed about it, sometimes how it manifests in the workplace is that their behavior becomes a little problematic because they're trying to hide the fact that they don't know something.
Yeah.
And so they'll either make something up or they'll fight the very concept. And so when they're arguing against or fighting the very concept, um, then, without actually digging in to, oh, okay, I didn't understand this, and that's okay. Doesn't make me a bad person. So I think that, yeah, there were too many thoughts about shame.
No,
Um,
there, it's interesting when you said that though, that especially in DEI work, and I've had these conversations with others. People will make mistakes. People will come from a place of growth. If we think about it from a place of growth and development, with the
Mm.
intention that people do want to connect with others and not harm others. And if I messed up or if I made a mistake previously, shaming is not going to make me want to move forward. I'm going to go into a corner and retreat or respond in other ways. And so, um, being able to understand the impact that shame has on ourselves, on our own behavior, but also on the behavior of others, especially in the work in DEI, I think is really quite relevant, right? You probably see it
It,
on a regular basis.
oh yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And we were talking about perfectionism. And there's a reason why it like she has this in the same chapter. And her quote, when she talks about shame, and she talks about shame in culture, and she gives some tools on the four elements of shame resilience, right? And so that on page 139, a really, really good tool.
Hmm.
But her quote is, where perfectionism exists, shame is always lurking. So
Yeah.
that was really fascinating to me, where she said shame is the birthplace of perfectionism.
Yeah.
Um, so perfectionism is not striving to be our best or working toward excellence. Healthy striving is internally driven. Perfectionism is externally driven by a simple but potentially all-consuming question: what will people think? Just like you
Yeah.
said.
Yeah.
But the fact that it is based in sort of shame, that's really, really fascinating. And I
Yeah.
don't think
No.
people really understand where perfectionism comes from.
And it's such a huge concept amongst our law students, our lawyers, and I think that understanding, peeling that away, I think is really, really relevant. I'm mindful of the time and your time this evening, and so let's jump to the last chapter that you and I wanted to talk about, which was places we go to self-assess. And I think that that whole ability to self-assess is really important for each and every one of us. But the language of pride, hubris, and that included reference to narcissism and humility. And I have to admit, this is where, in terms, oh, hubris, I heard it recently and I hadn't really, I don't know if I knew that word in the context of emotions. So it was a new word, and I was grateful to her for sort of educating me on that, because I think there is some hubris in our legal profession, if I am not mistaken. Inflated sense of one's own innate abilities that is tied more to the need for dominance than to actual accomplishments. But tell me
Yeah.
why, when we talked about this chapter, what was important for you to get across from this chapter?
So I think for me, it was that concept of narcissism.
Hmm.
And it is interesting that, there is sort of some research out there that doctors and lawyers are narcissists. And I think we probably all have some narcissistic
Hmm.
tendencies. Um, but the definition, or a quote that she says is, narcissism is the shame-based fear of being ordinary.
Yeah, wow. That's powerful.
Yeah. And I think that, I really had to slow down and really try, and again, it's shame again. It's shame-based.
Mhm.
Um, and for me, it's like these patterns of behaviors, this need for admiration, um, lack of empathy, which is classic narcissism. So for me, that was important to sort of draw the line, a direct link between lack of empathy and narcissism. And if narcissism is lack of empathy, and we need empathy as a core skill to be inclusive, compassionate legal professionals, I think that it's really important to understand what narcissism is, where it comes from, and then as she kind of then sort of goes into the section on humility.
Mhm.
right? And then understanding why humility is important. We can't possibly know everything.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that that emotion is a really important one for legal professionals, especially, you know, when I talk about cultural humility and when I talk about how our world is becoming increasingly diverse.
Mhm.
You know, we are a multicultural society, um, and it's an irreversible fact that that concept of cultural humility for sure, but also just humility to sort of like be, you know, my one of my favorite Ted Lasso quotes, you know, curiosity, not judgment.
Mhm.
Um, I think that is that's really interesting, an interesting concept as well. And here she says the term intellectual humility refers specifically to a willingness to consider information that doesn't fit with our current thinking, right?
Whoa. Yeah, that that's a good reminder for us,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. There are many ways of knowing the world. There are
Yeah.
many ways. You know, we all have culture, and we all navigate our world through our own cultural lenses.
Yeah.
And so it's important to respect those differences.
Yeah. No, I think it goes back to so many of the other elements that we just discussed as well, but understanding that your way is not necessarily the same way as everybody else's, and appreciating and being curious, sincerely, genuinely curious and interested in our fellow, humans and fellow colleagues is really important. And to your point, is why we've changed the conversation in the EQ/CQ course, the emotional intelligence and cultural intelligence, from intelligent cultural intelligence or cultural competence. You cannot be competent at culture. You can be, you have cultural humility, because you can't assume to know somebody's culture, especially not with intersectionality. We can go on into another conversation there,
Right,
but
right, right.
humility is so very important, not just in the context of culture, as you said, but in all other culture contexts as well. And the ability for us to stay curious is really critical. And I think that's one of the reasons I'm so glad, and we're going to wrap up soon, but I'm so glad that you provided this opportunity to me a year ago, and tonight to us and to anybody who's listening to it afterwards. I think it's really important. So, on that note, I want to put up a copy of your contact information just so that people can have your contact information. You're doing great work with the IDEA program at Siskins. Congratulations. And you love, love, love talking about emotions, as you said. So if anybody wants to connect with Mahwash or myself, you've got our contact information there. Remember, for Ontario lawyers who have heard this session, it is eligible for 1.5 hours of professionalism CPD. Um, Mahwash, I'm going to close with a quote from the author herself, because your energy and your time and your curiosity really has been quite meaningful to this conversation. And in her closing pages, she says, "The real gift of learning language, practicing this work, and it really is practicing, and cultivating meaningful connections, is being able to go anywhere without the fear of getting lost. Even when we have no idea where we are or where we're going, with the right map, we can find our way back to our heart and to our truest self." So I want to thank you for helping us to explore this map together, this tapestry of emotions together. And I'm very grateful to you always. And thank you very much for participating.
I really enjoyed this conversation, and thank you so much for inviting me, Gina. And you know, I know that so many of the principles we talked about today, like I know that they resonate with you. I mean, we only talked about a handful of emotions.
Yeah,
There's
yeah,
87.
exactly.
There's just a lot to dig through, and I really appreciate how you tie it back to the legal profession as well, because I think these are important conversations to have. And on that last chapter that we were talking about, one of the quotes that I use all the time is, you know, I'm not here to be right. I'm here to get it right. So I think that takes away that ego, you know, the egoistic need to sort of like be right. It's like, no, we're just, we're working towards a goal. And so even with this conversation, I just wanted to be able to just sort of shed the spotlight on some of this, some of these emotions that I think that we really need to start focusing on a little bit more, having these
Absolutely.
conversations. So I'm
Absolutely.
grateful for you to
More of
facilitate
these
that.
conversations. My pleasure. And
Yeah.
just a reminder to everybody as we wrap up, not only is this the last career conversation for the year, but it will be the last monthly career conversation. I'm going to be doing periodic career conversation book clubs next year in 2025. But I am absolutely, we talk about gratitude, grateful to everybody, all the authors, all the people who participated live, all the people who've watched the videos afterwards. I am absolutely grateful that you took something away from these conversations, and I hope you continue to have these career conversations moving forward. So, thank you to everybody. Happy holidays. Be safe in this weather as it is, and all the best for the new year. Thanks to everyone. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye.